In any event, you should understand that there are other people, and some are even here today, by the way, who go back further with St. Mark's than I do. For example, Gisla's family, the Steins, I think they were charter members, if I'm not mistaken. And Bill Weiler, sitting right back there, told me in church the other day, he was attending St. Mark's by 1953. Okay? If you paid attention to Gisla's bio with me, that was 2 years before I was born. So anyway, so just FYI, since I've been sitting here, I found out at least 2 other people were here by like 1957, 58, in that range. They were here. So look, okay, here's the point of all this. What I plan to do here today is offer a bit of historical information from the earliest years of St. Mark's. Okay, that's going to be the scope here, from around 1950 to 1973. After 73, that's all we're doing. Don't have time. Okay, a lot of it are my personal recollections. Why only the first 23 years? Well, there's the time constraint situation. You know, I learned from some students that the mind can only absorb what the posterior can withstand. Okay? And then the other thing is those years were the longest ago in time, so I'm figuring for most of you, those represent the days that are probably the most unfamiliar. Anyway, and the other thing about the earliest experiences that we have, those sort of create an indelible imprint for the rest of our lives. So, you know, I sort of have, and some of my memories might be a little off, because remember my age at the time and whatever. So please correct me, those of you that have sharper memories than I do, that would be helpful. Anyway, so that's the disclaimer. Is the information presented here will be mostly from my recollections, my perspective, my viewpoint, and there is no attempt being made here today to represent the views of St. Mark's as a collective. Okay? All right. Okay. So after I talk a bit, what I'd like to do is open this up to the rest of you, and you all could share this and tell us some of your favorite memories of St. Mark's. And that can be from any year. You know, we don't care. There's no limits on that. Okay, now we're going to start at the very beginning, which is the genesis of the church, if you will. Almost all of this is already recorded in some historical pamphlets that were produced by members of the congregation years ago. I think they've gone through 3 editions. They were updated twice from the first incarnation. So you can look for those. I'm sure they're in the church files here somewhere if you don't already have one personally. Although Huntsville, Alabama, was one of the oldest settlements in Alabama, in fact, it was the oldest English settlement, there was no Lutheran church here. In fact, Judy Stiles just told me she doesn't think there was a Lutheran church in the state of Alabama until St. Mark's was organized. Now, there is some information in the historical pamphlets that say that some Lutheran services were being conducted in the home of a woman named Mrs. Hawkins in her home on Whitesburg Drive in the 1940s. Okay, I'm sure none of us would remember her. But even later in that decade, at the Russell Erskine Hotel downtown, they were having Lutheran services of some sort. Then with the influence of the German rocket scientists, in the later 1940s and early 50s, there was a guy named William Hartman, who was a seminary student from the United Lutheran Church in America. You're nodding, Gisela, like you might remember him, do you? No, okay, I didn't just nod. Okay. He was sent in 1950 to conduct services at Huntsville. So here is a little bit, in case you're not familiar with the United Lutheran Church, I really was not. Here's a little bit of information about the United Lutheran Church of America. It was established in 1918 after the merger of 3 German language synods. Okay? In September of 1950, there was a Dr. William Stepp who came from Atlanta to conduct services, Lutheran services, at the old Fifth Avenue Elementary School, which was a few blocks from here. It's now part of the Huntsville Hospital property, over there on Governor's Drive. Governor's Drive was once called Fifth Avenue, just for those who don't know that. So, according to our history, there were 7 men who secured earnest money to purchase the very first church property, and this was catty-cornered from here, as we say in the South, on the northwest corner of Longwood and Franklin, you know, just directly across. And that property was Chambers Funeral Home. Okay? And the early church members quickly converted that funeral home into a place of worship, as well as next to it a parsonage for a church's family. Now you will see this was the funeral home, and Mr. Angela, Wilhelm Angela from the congregation, and a fellow named, and I don't remember him, Gisela, Fichtner, is that right? F-I-T-C-H-N-E-R, how do you say it? Fichtner. Yeah, they apparently built this steeple that you see here on top of it. That's what the information said. And also they built the altar, the first altar. So we had some talented people, to put it mildly, in that congregation. And I'll say a little bit more about Mr. Angelo in a bit. He was a pretty important person in the history of the church. In 1950, just to put this in context, Huntsville was a small town of about 16,000 people. 16,000 people. Okay, and the site of the new church was within the city limits, but just barely. Okay, the city limits pretty much stopped, like right around here somewhere. My parents, my dad built the house a few blocks from here on Brandon Street. I'm not sure it was even Brandon Street then, but it was in like 47, and it was a rabbit field. Okay, there was nothing, there wasn't much, as they call civilization, around these parts then. Much, much smaller, and it's hard for us to get our minds wrapped around that maybe. Anyway, in February 1951, let's see if I can work this thing. Oh, here's another picture. This is the parsonage that was next to it. In February 1951, the United Lutheran Church Board of Missions called Reverend George Hart, who was then of Jacksonville, Florida, to organize the new mission church. Okay? We think, I don't see this in the historical pamphlets, but I think Tracy did some research on this. We think the name St. Mark's may have come from George Hart, as that was the name of his most recent church in Florida. Okay, if anybody has any information counter to that, please let us know. Reverend Hart had spent, before he came here, he had spent 17 years of his life organizing mission churches elsewhere. So that was kind of his thing. That was his specialization, I guess, if you'd call it that. The church started out with 72 members. Of those, almost all of them, well, I think 60-something out of 70-something, were German rocket scientists and their families. Almost from the beginning, there were two services. Almost from the beginning, there were two services. One was at 8:30 and one was at 11. So you can see how much we've changed. A choir sang at both services, and there was a small electric organ that was played. And the church grew rapidly, in large measure, due to Pastor Hart's dynamism. He was a force of nature and a whirlwind of activity. By 1953, there were 239 baptized members. What Pastor Hart did was he immersed himself in the community. And he established St. Mark's quickly as a visible presence in Huntsville. He was president of the Rotary Club, chair of the Red Cross Fund Drive. He spoke at numerous high school graduations, local PTA meetings. He was a founding member of the Symphony Board. I mean, you name it. Pastor Hart was everywhere. Now, if you do this, like I just did, I went to an online newspaper database of the Huntsville Times. Okay, I did a search on George Hart. I retrieved 3,746 references from 1950 until 65, which is the year he's dead. Okay? That's 3,746 newspaper articles about George Hart during that time period. A phenomenal number. However you measure it. Almost as soon as it was organized, St. Mark's was more than just a place of worship. There was Sunday school, there was a youth group, a group for the women of the church, and Vacation Bible School this summer, right from the beginning, right from 51. Christmas Eve, 1951, began the long tradition, which we still observe, still enjoy, of the traditional candlelight service, where we sing Silent Night, and Pastor Hart evidently brought that type of service with him from Florida. That service was a midnight Christmas Eve service, beginning at 11 o'clock and then ending at midnight, with the coming of Christmas, right? And that was unusual for Huntsville at that time, or really for almost any time, because I remember when we still had that service, there were people from other faiths, other denominations that would come to that, just simply because we had something like that. Another distinguishing characteristic of the Christmas Eve service was the Christmas story message which he delivered every year, and he became sort of locally famous for. And there's probably a copy of that Christmas message in the file somewhere. I'm assuming yes. She's nodding yes. Okay. This week, I talked to former member Ingrid Furman. Some of you really long-time people may remember Ingrid. We're going way back now. She was a young woman of like 11 or 12 during those years. She's now selling real estate in Phoenix, is what she's doing. Anyway, she and her parents, her dad came here with Von Braun, as so many of these other people did. They all attended St. Mark's in those early years. And since I wasn't around then, I mean, physically, I called her to say, give me some of your memories. And she mostly said, well, there was no air conditioning in the old church. And it was hot as heck. And that was the word she used, was heck. So, okay. As the church was growing, in March 1952, the Board of Missions advanced a loan to secure the lot where we are now. Okay, on the southeast corner of Franklin. And then a building committee was formed, and my father was the chairman of the building committee, and Mr. Ongle was on it, and a few other people. And they planned, they designed the sanctuary on this property, and I think we've got it. Yeah. Okay, that's sort of an early picture of it, because it's still got the sign from the old church. Okay, and then it's got the cross there in front. And it's not a real good image, but I mean, look, a lot of these images I took out the scrap line, I captured on my phone. So sorry about that. But anyway, maybe you can make sense of it. There may be, that's a little better. That's a little later, because originally it was just the sanctuary that was here. And this other part where I don't know if you can see the arches over here on the extreme end, that was added on later. Anyway, if you were to time travel and go back and look at the church then, you would be struck by how many children and young people were there during that time. This was the baby boom, okay? And in 1955, I was one of the babies who moved. By the way, I said Mr. Ongle was on this building committee, which he was. Just so you know, he also built the first observatory on the Senate Mountain. Okay. He also, many decades later, helped build the harpsichord that's at St. Mark's. Built it from a kit. So anyway, he's had abundant talents. And we've been fortunate at St. Mark's, as many of you know, to have people with extremely superior talents to help us in many ways. The new sanctuary was designed to seat about 250 people. But one feature of the new church was a separated room at the rear of the sanctuary. An overflow room, but mostly for parents with children, what Pastor Jason has called a crying room. He said, oh, you had a crying room. Yeah, we did. From there, you could see the service, but you could not see the service, sorry, you could not see the service, but you could hear it through loudspeakers that were mounted back there. So, and it really on Christmas Eve, which is what I most remember, it was definitely an overflow room because it was packed on Christmas Eve. The church in the town of Huntsville kept growing. Sunday school was still being held in the old building during these years, and it was full. And I especially remember Gisela leading us in song. I don't know where Gisela went. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay, you're hiding. Okay, I especially remember you leading us in song, and we would sing stuff like "Do Lord," and "Jesus loves me, this I know," and "Jesus loves the little children," and "This little light of mine," and "I've got joy, joy down in my heart," and those kind of songs. And her beautiful voice, helped us out there. The other thing you would have noticed, if you were to time travel, as I was talking about earlier, is how many of the people here had German last names. And for many of them, German was the first language. So that made for some interesting dynamics. Yeah. To create more space for education, the parsonage moved to a new house for Pastor Hart. So that's inside the sanctuary. That's in 1966. I'm moving ahead a little bit. There's another sanctuary. Where'd it go? Okay, here it is. That's the house. It still exists on Chadwell Road, where the Harts lived. They moved there in 1958. It was Pastor Hart, his wife David, and they had two sons, David and Jonathan. Right out of the Bible, right out of the Old Testament. Shot, yeah, well, they call Jonathan Shot. And David later became a pastor, right? So, anyway. But in 1960, Pastor Hart had his first heart attack. He recovered from that, and I recently learned, and I don't think Gisela knew this either, which is a shock. I recently learned that the church at that time added an assistant pastor, who I have a recollection of, named Milan Delaney, L-A-N-Y, Delaney.
I think, or Delani.
Was he German?
No,
Okay.
not that I remember.
It says he was a missionary from Tanganyika. That's what it said. Okay. He was only there a year, but I just thought, I don't remember him at all. And then in 1961, the educational building, which was still the old church, it burned. Okay. And so they had to move Sunday school and some other things to another location. And businesses around the area took us in. Okay. The garage of Lee Bentley Motors was next door, and so some of the classes were held in the garage of the dealership. The Snow White Cafe, which is where Burger King is now, they had some classes in there. The barber shop, which was right around the corner. You know? So anyway, being adaptive, I guess, is a characteristic of the congregation. In 1962, what was the United Lutheran Church became part of the New Synod, which was then the Lutheran Church in America. As the population grew and the city limits of Huntsville grew, other LCA congregations in Huntsville were formed. There was Prince of Peace on Mascot, I think it was on Mascot Lake Road, right? Okay, in North Huntsville. And then there was Emmanuel Lutheran Church on Highway 20, old Highway 20, near where the Sunday Bakery used to be in Madison. And then two Missouri Synod congregations were also being formed. There was Grace, which is still there on the Parkway, and then Ascension, which I think is still there also on Oakwood. One event of 1963 that united Christians of different races, congregations, and denominations across Huntsville was the erecting of the 74-foot, 38-ton, gleaming white concrete cross on Montesano. Now, how many of you are familiar with that cross? Yeah, maybe about a third of the people. Okay. It's near the Burke Museum up there, and I think it's still there. It was a project of the Huntsville Ministerial Association, I learned. And I remember my mother telling me, and some of you know more about this than I did, I remember my mother told me that St. Mark's had some part in that. People in the congregation. Have y'all heard anything about that? Okay, I don't know what she knew. She's not here to tell us. The enormous cross, it was lit up at night with floodlights. Okay, it also had marbleized chips on its face to reflect light even better than that. So you could see it at night. I mean, and during the day too, for that matter. But all across the valley, you know, down here. In fact, if you Google this, which I did, there is a hiking trail still that goes up to that cross. So those of you that are adventurers and like to hike, you might want to see it. But what I understand is some huge trees have grown all around it, and so it really obscures the view of it now, unfortunately. In early 1965, let's see if sorry, there's the cross right there. Can you see it?
The hiking trail is relatively easy.
Is it? Good. Yeah. Recently, have you been?
A year ago?
Oh, yeah, that's recent. Recent for me. Yeah, okay. Let's see, there was something else I was going to show you. Whoops. Yeah, here we go. In early 1965, the house behind St. Mark's, this one that was facing Westmoreland Avenue, was purchased by the church to house some of the expanding Sunday school classes. And also the Boy Scout Troop 13, is that right, Bill? Because he was in the Boy Scout Troop. Okay, Boy Scout Troop number 13, and that was founded by, was it Ken Cooley? Was he involved?
No, he was later, but
Okay.
Phil Hugel,
Phil Hugel.
Appler.
Gilbert Appler.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, Gilbert Appler. They were the ones involved in that. Yeah, we had a Boy Scout troop at the church. In the autumn of '65, Pastor Hart had another heart attack, and this one would prove to be fatal. He was taken to the hospital, and reports were that he was resting comfortably. I remember this. And even appeared to be improving, was going to get out of the hospital, everybody said. And his untimely death was a huge shock, not only for St. Mark's, but for really all of Huntsville. It made a real impact in this town. In the entire time I knew my father, I never saw him more upset and grieving than I did the day he learned of Pastor Hart's death. I was at supper club the other night, St. Mark's Supper Club, and was sitting near Kathy Niemeyer, who was in the church then also, and she said, you know, her dad had the same emotion, same thing. He was total shock and upset. George Hart had organized the church, and he served it for almost 15 years. Pastors James Wessenauer and Joseph Holt, who at the time were in Huntsville seeking to organize the other congregations I mentioned, Emmanuel and Prince of Peace, they filled in capably for a while until they could find another full-time pastor. And they found one, I think that's Pastor Curtis Derrick. And Pastor Derrick was experienced. Can you see? I'm sorry, I'm probably blocking the screen for you. Okay. Pastor Derrick was experienced, and he had plenty of energy too. He was more of an academic than Pastor Hart. He was not as much of a people person, I would say. His sermons definitely had a more scholarly tone, and he presented complex concepts, and he used theological language. My father quit attending church as much. He said he couldn't understand the sermons anymore. I don't know how much that reflected other people, but that was his experience. Pastor Derrick, though, he loved serving as a mentor to budding ministers. And every year, while he was there, we had a vicar assistant him. We actually had one during Pastor Hart's time. The first vicar was Ralph Woody, and that was right toward Pastor Hart's last year, I think. But then we had a series of vicars while Pastor Derrick, every year there was a new vicar. And I became well acquainted with most of them because they worked with youth. And I was getting to the point where I was getting to be a teenager. And anyway, the vicars shared the pulpit workload. They assisted in teaching confirmation. And they participated in visiting families. During the late 60s, the Huntsville economy was booming as never before. NASA was nearing its goal of landing men on the moon. The membership of St. Mark's was approaching 1,000 people, if you could believe that. It may even have exceeded that number. I don't know. I don't have the exact data here in front of me. But nonetheless, it was a full church. A balcony had been constructed a few years before in that sanctuary, and even it was full many Sundays. Now, I'll tell you, we teenagers, we like to sit in the balcony to get away from our parents. Okay, and we get a few giggles and misbehavior. You know, we do some of that up there. Because, you know, during that time, Pastor Derrick's services were very high church. Okay, very full. But toward 1970, we began occasionally, and this is the key word here, occasionally, experimenting with some more contemporary song forms. There was a little book that was issued sometime in the early 70s that had, let's see, I can't think of the names of the songs anymore, I'm sorry. But anyway, there were some songs, some of them we still sing today. But that's when, you know, this was coming out. Also in 1970, there was a Zimmer pipe organ was given to St. Mark's by the William Tucker family. They were part of the church, William and Judy Tucker. For many years, the organist at St. Mark's was Peter Yankee, who had grown up in the congregation, and the choir director was Norma Stagner's husband, Paige Stagner. And I will never forget, Peter Yankee playing the organ, and while the sermon was going on, he'd pull out his stash of comic books. And he'd read his comic books during the sermon. Anyway, with a tip here. In the late 60s, the women of the church began making the chrismons that we still make today. For a time, there was a St. Mark's Chrismon tree on display at the old Dunman's Mall, if some of you remember that. And that was its own way, I suppose, of evangelizing. You know, it's in its passive way, I suppose. But, you know, it's at least getting the visibility of St. Mark's out there in the general public. It's one way of doing it. It was beautiful. It's nice. One other thing I should mention is for years, St. Mark's had a reputation for sending many, maybe a stretch, some of its sons and daughters to the ministry. Okay, the first one I think was Phil Hugel's son, Phil Hugel Jr. And there again, I mean, you can look in the literature that's available. You can see some of the others. I can't recount all those for us, but there have been several. And many of those became ministers in the ELCA Southeastern Synod, by the way. Now, until about 1970, this is just a curious fact that I happen to remember. The church was open, unlocked, for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if you can believe that. And that remained to be true until about 1970, and then there was a vandalism incident. Anybody remember this? Yeah. Anyway, and so then they started thinking about locking it up. But that was the way times were then. I mean, we left our house open, wide open, and then one day we got home and found some people going through our drawers, at home, and we thought, well, better lock that out. In 1972, Pastor Derrick and his family left to become Director of Development at the Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary. Now, in terms of my personal life, that was the beginning of my senior year in high school. Okay, we had no full-time pastor for over a year. Serving as interim pastor was Dr. Donald Armitage, who was a Lutheran, but he taught ecclesiastical history at the University of the South in Swanee, which is, Episcopalian. And Armitage, he must have begun his long commute from Swanee, because you know how far Swanee is from he must have started before dawn, because, remember we had an 8:30 service. And to get here that early, we wouldn't be here before the church started, and I'd see his car sitting out there, he had a little bitty car, he's a little bitty man anyway. But, and so he officiated 2 services during that time when we needed him. And I'll have a little more to say about him in a few minutes. Okay, there's more I could say about the church history overview from 50 to 73, but before I stop, Gisela wanted me to talk about a few personal memories. So is that all right with y'all? Then I'll continue some of that. First is the annual Easter egg hunts at Crone Farm in Monroeville. The big prize was a golden egg, which wasn't really a golden egg, it was a regular egg wrapped in gold foil. And the lesser big prize was a silver egg, which was wrapped in. Okay. As prizes, you would get Easter baskets filled with lots of chocolate bunnies and other chocolate. One year I ate so much chocolate I got sick. Speaking of food, and food is getting to be sort of the central theme here, I don't know. Anyway, many of my favorite memories seem to involve food. Every congregational meeting seemed to have a potluck associated with it. That was a characteristic of St. Mark's. Everyone seemed to be a good cook. It must have been required for membership. I don't know. But you better have had a taste for German food, because there was lots of that, believe me. And I was used to that because, we had Germans living around us there over there where Gisela was living, the Furmans and him. Also, most of my most vivid memories of a bygone time are the annual picnics we had at Osawinda Camp on Lake Gunnersville. After the late Sunday service, you'd be a part of this caravan of cars heading east. And some of the church members brought kayaks. 1 or 2 had ukuleles. And there were lots of cans of beer. You remember that. And once again, I don't know if I've said this enough, good food. Okay. Of course, there were the Christmas Eve services. Kathy Niemeyer wanted me to mention that after the children's Christmas Eve service, all the children would get bags of Hershey's Kisses. And the congregation would bring canned goods wrapped in white tissue paper to give to the needy. Then there was the Vacation Bible School. Every year, let's see, okay. All of us children remember quite fondly this guy, Mr. Frank Humphrey. Not a member of the congregation, but he served as what was called sexton, which is a fancy word for custodian and groundskeeper. And he's the only paid full-time one in the church's history. Frank delighted in children. And in Vacation Bible School, he'd service that ice cream, those like paper cups with the wooden spoons, and the cartons of the Metagold orange drink. And anyway, that's what we had. And Gisela, you have a story about him too, right? With Kim, did you say?
Yes, she was saying that all the kids loved Frank, or he loved them, and the Coke machines at that time dispensed 10-cent Cokes. And so he would go around and he'd say, "Do you have a dime?" And if they didn't, he'd give them a dime. So he would always be prepared to hand out dimes so the kids could get their Cokes.
Yeah. One thing a lot of people don't know about Frank is he was illiterate. He was plenty smart, but he couldn't read. One day, some workers had painted the inside of the church, and Frank, without knowing it, touched the paint and smeared paint a few places. Okay? And so when the workers discovered it, they said, well, didn't you see that wet paint sign over there? He said, oh yeah, I saw it. I just couldn't read it. That was Frank. And all these people, I guess they're special involved. So many of these people for years. I should mention my experience with the confirmation program in the late 60s. It was a 3-year program, confirmation was, not 2 years, it is today. And classes were held at the church every Monday afternoon, immediately after school. The first year, kids in 7th grade were taught by a lay person. The second year, we were instructed by the vicar. The last year, you had the pastor, okay, who in our case was Pastor Derek. He was a natural pedagogue, okay, and he took his responsibilities most seriously. You certainly did not want to face the displeasure of Pastor Derek. There was lots of rote memorization. It seemed as though we memorized almost the entirety of Luther's small catechism. For exams, you had to sit 2 pews apart from one another so you didn't cheat. Okay? We actually had someone fail confirmation during the years that I was there. So Pastor Jason, when he talked about all this for me after one meeting that we had, he said, so what do you retain from all this? I said, well, not much, to be honest about it. But quite honestly, I most vividly recall the field trips we took to churches of other faiths, where we learned about the worship experiences that other people had. It was almost like a college course in comparative religion, and I remember that. You remember, I don't know if there's a lesson there or not, but you remember field trips, you remember things like that. Anyway, there was also the teen youth group, and it was called the Lutheran League, which sounds like some kind of militia league. We met Sunday evenings at 6 o'clock, and we had to miss the wonderful world of Disney to do that. And it was led by dedicated lay people and occasionally assisted by the vicar. There were lots of activities. Yearly retreats, we'd be gone to some cabin in the woods 100 miles from here and study the scripture and talk about the scripture's application in modern life. In the 1960s, what was going on with the civil rights movement, Vietnam War, and the rebellion of the young was in the air. I remember the sponsors showing us films on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And we talked about how one day they might be looked upon as the heroes of our generation. We would listen to contemporary music and talk about why the songwriters wrote those lyrics and what they were trying to say. The sponsors and the vicars certainly didn't shy away from that stuff, and for that we respected them. You didn't hear those viewpoints in the Huntsville City school system, which was still largely segregated, by the way. And in the school system, it was fearful of addressing topics that might engender some controversy. Each year, we would all go by invitation to a fabulous house, the Hirschler's house, on the top of Montesano, the crest of Montesano Mountain. They had an Olympic-sized pool, and the view was spectacular. And some of us really looked forward to that. That was cool. The Lutheran League also each year drove to the houses of elderly and shut-ins and sang Christmas carols on their doorsteps. I still remember in particular one German lady who would give each of us teenagers a bottle of champagne to take home to our parents. And most of us did. I mean, most of us did. We did. And then finally, a vivid memory was my senior year of high school when you're trying to figure out who you are and where you're going in life. That's just what happens when you're about to finish, something like that. I mentioned our interim pastor was this guy, Dr. Armentrout, who was highly educated, a diminutive guy, maybe 5'4" at the most. I'm not sure he was even that tall. Balding, small in stature but forceful presence in the pulpit. Professor at Swan. He had, let's say, unorthodox views for the South. he challenged the comfort of the congregation with his sermons. And some folks liked that, and some people didn't like that. Since he was on the interim, I think he cared a whole lot. And I loved it because he was making me think. And I was at that age where I felt I was on the precipice of something, that I needed that. But he did develop a very loyal following among many in the church, and he returned many times years later to present a series of lectures on church history for the Vanderbilt University Divinity School program that they used to have here. I remember one of his sermons talked about the different ways we might worship idols. And he even mentioned as an example that some folks might worship the Bible instead of God. Okay, that was strong stuff to say in those days. And perhaps any day. Okay, well with that I'm going to stop. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing some of these reminiscences. Please, any of you have chimed in, because this is just my voice. And, I think we all want to hear more than just me. So, y'all tell us about some of your memories of St. Mark.
I think we need to thank you first for what you've done.
Not bad for a volunteer.
Okay.
Robert, I want to make an ad for the confirmation pictures that are over at the gathering place. If you go over there,
Excuse me.
see the pictures of anything.
We can't, would you use the mic? We can't hear you.
Here, okay.
Thank you.
If you go over to the gathering place outside the office and look at the confirmation pictures, I invite you to look at each and every one of them, because we think that all the confirmation pictures are up. In particular, in 1960, you can see the confirmation pictures of one Bobby Burkhardt.
And it was missing for a long time.
Oh, it was a couple of years of these things keep coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah, and we found, I think the Canizzo family actually had one, is what I heard. And the Canizzos is where I was in Luther League, as I mentioned, and we were at the Canizzos' house having a get-together when the men landed on the moon, when the spaceship landed that day. So that's the vivid memory of it. Anybody else want to share? Yeah.
There were Lutheran churches in Alabama before St. Mark's.
Okay.
My grandmother was baptized in 1889 in Hansford.
Oh, that's right. Of course.
And by the 1880s, there was three Lutheran churches in Holland.
Yeah. Because my dad actually was baptized and confirmed at the Lutheran Church in Poland, so that's just a dub moment on my part. Yeah.
And there, I think, a church in Florence.
Okay. So, Judy, I'm not listening to you. Okay. Anybody else want to share? Yeah.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'll stand back here and maybe you all can hear me. I moved to Huntsville in 1964 and met my husband, Jeff, at the University of Alabama, and his family was going to St. Mark's. We got married in 1966, and it was between Pastor Hart and Pastor Derek. And so it turned out that we got married by a part-time Baptist minister because there wasn't a full-time preacher at that time. And the other thing that I remember about my wedding is that, and it was the different sanctuary at that time. It was the longest aisle that I had to go down there.
Yeah, and I don't think I mentioned this, but the first sanctuary here on this property was designed by a famous church architect out of Philadelphia. So I don't know why they designed it in such a way where it had such a long, but that was one of the things that the musicians didn't like either, was the design of the church, because instead of being, fuller, it was just long and straight and narrow. And apparently the sound did not project that well.
And just two sides to
Right,
it.
right,
I
right.
mean, it was,
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Anyway, it was, you know, but that's all we knew. We didn't know anything, I didn't. I just thought that was church. Yeah. Anybody else? Gisela, you want to say something? You got your hand sort of half up. Okay.
I was instructed.
Um,
Norma Stagner asked me to say a couple of things. She is recovering from pneumonia, and she wanted to thank St. Mark's for allowing her to have an office here. It was in the Westmoreland House, and that is because she was head of Lutheran Ministries of Alabama.
there's nobody there.
And for about 5 years. And unfortunately, it's not very active today, and so maybe that's something that we could look into and reestablish. But St. Mark's had a big part in getting that program started. And so she just wanted to make sure that that was remembered. And of course, she has one of her daughters is a minister in Atlanta, and Terry, right. And so she just wanted to, was so sorry she couldn't be here.
And that's, I should say, that's one thing I failed to mention was about all the great service work that was going on. I'm sure it was going on in the 60s. Well, Norma was, if not the prime mover, she was certainly one of them in the service work that was being done as part of the congregation. Terrific things. I know my mom and some of her friends did later on did Meals on Wheels. You know, that was a big part. I guess that was maybe before the food pantry got going.
No, we still do it. We still do it.
Meals on Wheels still going?
Yeah.
Okay, see, I don't know what goes on in this church. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so I remember that. Anybody else with things you can remember? I know everybody's eating dessert now. So.
Do you have some more pictures you can show?
Oh, yeah, there's a few more pictures. I probably breeze through some of them, because, let's see, I don't have any from past 73 now, because I decided I had to cut it off. But here's the pipe organ that we mentioned that came in 1970. There's the pipe sitting right. And you can kind of see the organ. That's from the Tiki family. Okay, the Tikis actually they actually built on and added to this organ, right? In the later years, in memory of their daughter. Isn't that right?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Oh, was the Tikis did pipes? Okay. I thought we had a pipe organ even in 1970, but maybe not. Okay. There's the Westmoreland House. Now the Westmoreland House also had the offices of the pastor for a while. Were over there later on. The memory I have of the Westmoreland House was soon after it was acquired, we people in the Lutheran League, I guess they couldn't get better help than what they did, but we painted it on the inside. And I can trace that exactly to when it was. It was March of '68. And the reason I know that is I remember what songs were on the radio. Because we had a transistor radio with us while we were painting. And so that helps you kind of trace it. So anyway, that's when we were painting there. And we have a lot of Sunday school was held over there, Boy Scouts, and then later church offices too, and Norman's office, I guess, that was mentioned. So, Pastor Derek, there's the balcony that had the plaques of the disciples, that we know. They were right there mounted on the front of it, and that's where all the teenagers were. You can't see them, but they were back there misbehaving. And there's the stairs that went up to them. Yeah, pretty steep. Yeah, that's probably why you didn't have too many older people going up to the balcony. There's the cross, we saw the cross. Pastor Hart's house. There's the arches that were part of when the educational wing was added on to the sanctuary. That was, I guess, one of the distinguishing architectural characteristics was that. Sanctuary inside, old church. Not sure what year that is. And there it is for Easter Sunday, which I think is a lovely picture. I wish there was a better image, but anyway.
So was the church oriented 90 degrees? The the altar was at the end of a building?
Yeah, the altar was at the very end, and then it was a long, narrow, what's the church word for that? Aisle. It's a long, narrow aisle. that led up to the altar, yeah. And the choir would be over here behind the lectern, and then the organ would be across, behind the pulpit. Okay, that's the way that was. And that's why the pastor couldn't see the organist with his comic books. Because he was sitting behind him. Yeah, don't tell Patrick about the comic books. I don't know, I'm glad he's not here. Okay, and there's the church. Shelby, I thought, and I guess we don't, maybe I took it out and I didn't mean to, there was a picture of the old dogwood tree.
That was one of the ones that we took out, yeah.
Oh, man, don't let me be in charge of anything. Yeah, there was a nice little, not little, an enormous dogwood tree that seemed to bloom every Easter. It was so cool. And then there was a cross made out of what was it, just a vine? I can't say that word. Pyracantha. Pyracantha? Pyracantha, that's the plural, I guess, Latin. Pyracantha. Yeah, and it was on the wall right above it. And you can see that photo in the scrapbooks. I'm sorry I took it out. That was a mistake. And I think you've seen the other photos.
Yeah.
There's the card, there's that. That's the beginning, so yeah. So thank you, Shelby, for helping with that. Anybody else want to contribute? You want to contribute? Okay.
Well, I just wanted to thank you especially because I know that it took a lot of work to put all that together, and thank you so much, Shelby, for helping. And it's so nice now that we can film things and help our remembrances in the future. I wanted to say especially thank you to you, Bobby, and Dr. Robert Burkhardt. Thank you so much. I came across this quote, and it just reminded me talking about remembrances. And it said, church is about relationships. Our relationship with Christ and our relationship with each other as followers of Christ all springs out of these things: worship, learning, service, true community. And I think this has shown it today, that that's what we are. We are family, and so we have to continue working on those things. And speaking of working on things, in May, we are going to have another Free Spirits. It's going to be back to the traditional, the third Thursday of the month. And then after that, we will break for summer and hopefully start again if all the viruses will leave us alone. And and I hope you enjoyed today. It's been our pleasure. Please stay as long as you like and just talk with each other. And if anybody wants to dry dishes, you're welcome to do that too.